And here are moments in life when the silence of God feels louder than anything else. You kneel down to pray. Your heart is heavy, your eyes close, and you whisper a prayer that comes from the deepest place in your soul. You ask God for help. You ask Him for direction, and you ask Him to move in a situation that feels impossible. And after the prayer ends, nothing seems to change. The problem is still there. The pain is still there, and the uncertainty is still there. And the hardest part of all, God seems silent. Many believers have experienced this moment, a moment when faith feels tested, and a moment when the heart quietly asks a painful questions. God, where are you? But here is something you must understand today, and just because God is silent does not mean God is absent. Silence is not the same thing as abandonment. God has not forgotten you. God has not ignored your prayers, and God has not walked away from your life. In fact, some of the greatest works God does in our lives happen during the seasons when everything seems quiet, and because silence is often where faith begins to grow. There are people listening right now who feel exhausted from waiting. You have prayed about something for a long time, and maybe you prayed for healing. Maybe you prayed for financial help. Maybe you prayed for peace in your family. Maybe you prayed for direction in your future, but instead of clear answers, there has only been waiting. And waiting can be one of the hardest tests of faith. Because our human nature wants immediate results, and we want answers today. We want solutions right now. But God does not operate on our timetable. God works according to His perfect timing, and His timing is always connected to His greater plan. Sometimes God delays the answer, not to hurt us, but to prepare us. Because the truth is this, if God gave us everything immediately, we might not be ready for the blessing. So, He works in ways we cannot always see. Think about a farmer planting a seed, and when the seed goes into the soil, everything looks the same on the surface. If you walked past that field the next day, you would not see anything growing, and the soil would look quiet, still, unchanged. But beneath the surface, life is forming. Roots are spreading, strength is developing, and growth is happening where human eyes cannot see it. And after enough time passes, a small green shoot breaks through the ground. What looked like silence, was actually preparation. Your life is often the same way. There are seasons when God is working beneath the surface of your circumstances. You cannot see it yet, and you cannot understand it yet. But something important is taking place. God is building your faith. God is shaping your character, and God is preparing you for something greater than you imagined. But the struggle of waiting is real. Sometimes the waiting brings questions. Questions like, did I hear God correctly? Did God forget about me? Why are other people moving forward while I feel stuck? These questions are part of the human experience, and even strong believers have faced them. Even the greatest leaders in the Bible experienced moments of confusion and waiting. Think about the life of Joseph. And God gave Joseph a dream about his future. A dream that showed he would rise to a position of great influence. But after the dream, his life became incredibly difficult, and his own brothers betrayed him. They sold him into slavery. He was taken far from home. Later, he was falsely accused of a crime he did not commit, and then he was thrown into prison. Imagine how confusing that must have been. God had given him a dream of greatness, but his reality looked like suffering. Years passed, and days in prison turned into months. Months turned into years. And there is no record that God explained the situation to Joseph. God did not tell him the timeline, and God did not reveal the full plan. Joseph had to live through the silence. But what Joseph could not see at the time, was that God was positioning him for something extraordinary. Every difficult season was shaping his character. Every moment of waiting was preparing him for leadership, and at the exact moment God had planned, everything changed. In a single day, Joseph went from prison to the palace, from forgotten prisoner to leader of a nation, and the silence had not been wasted. The waiting had not been meaningless. God had been working the entire time. And maybe you are in a season like that right now, and maybe you are in a chapter of life where things feel uncertain. Maybe you are praying, but the answers are slow. Maybe the future feels unclear, but do not assume that silence means nothing is happening. God often does His greatest work in the quiet seasons. Because quiet seasons teach us something powerful, and they teach us to trust God, not just when we see miracles, but even when we cannot see anything at all, and And that kind of faith is the kind of faith that changes a life forever. And one of the most difficult experiences in the Christian life is learning how to trust God when He seems silent. When prayers are answered quickly, faith feels easy. And when doors open immediately, believing feels natural. But when heaven is quiet, when the answers do not come, when the future feels uncertain, and that is when faith is truly tested. Because faith is not simply believing when everything goes well. Faith is trusting God even when nothing makes sense. And sometimes we imagine that if God truly loved us, He would immediately remove problem from our lives. But the truth is God is not only concerned with our comfort, and He is concerned with our transformation. God is shaping us into the people He created us to be. And that process often requires seasons of waiting. And think about the way a sculptor creates a beautiful statue. When a sculptor begins working with a block of stone, the process does not look gentle. Pieces are chipped away, and edges are carved. The stone is struck again and again. But every strike has a purpose. The sculptor sees the finished masterpiece long before anyone else can see it. And in the same way, God sees the finished version of your life. He sees the person you are becoming. He sees the strength your faith will carry. And He sees the impact your life will have. But reaching that purpose requires shaping. And sometimes God uses quiet seasons to shape our hearts. And silence also teaches us something very important. It teaches us to depend on God, not just on His answers. Many people seek God only when they need something, and they pray when they want a solution. They seek Him when they need direction. But true faith learns to seek God simply because He is God. Even if the answer takes time, and even if the miracle has not arrived yet, even if the road ahead is still unclear, faith says, God, even if I do not understand this season, I will still trust You. And that kind of faith is powerful. Because it is not built on circumstances. It is built on the character of God. And one of the greatest dangers during silent seasons is discouragement. Discouragement whispers lies into our minds. It says things like, your prayers are not working, and God is helping everyone else but not you. Maybe your situation will never change. But those thoughts do not come from God. They come from fear. They come from doubt, and they come from the enemy who wants to weaken your faith. But the truth is this: God hears every prayer. Not one prayer you have spoken has been ignored, and not one tear you have cried has been unnoticed. God sees everything. God hears everything. And God remembers everything, even when the answer is delayed. And sometimes God delays answers because He is aligning circumstances. You may only see your small piece of the situation, but God sees the entire picture, and He sees people you have not met yet. He sees opportunities that have not appeared yet. He sees doors that will open at the perfect moment. And sometimes if the answer came too early, those doors would not exist yet. So God waits. Not because He has forgotten you, but because He is arranging things you cannot see. Think about the story of Abraham. God promised Abraham something incredible, and God told him that he would become the father of a great nation. But there was a problem. Abraham and his wife Sarah were already very old. Years passed, and then more years passed, and still the promise did not happen. Imagine waiting not months, not years, but decades. During those years, Abraham had to continue believing even when the promise seemed impossible. And finally, when the time was exactly right, God fulfilled His promise. The miracle came, and not early, not late, exactly on time. Because God's timing is always perfect. Many people give up right before the breakthrough. They stop believing, they stop praying, and they stop trusting. But what they do not realize is that God may be closer to the answer than they think. Sometimes the silence comes just before the miracle, and just before the door opens, just before the breakthrough appears. That is why it is so important to keep trusting God during the quiet seasons, and because the story is not finished yet. God is still writing the next chapter of your life. If you feel like God has been silent in your life, do not lose heart, and silence is not rejection. Silence is often preparation. God is working in ways you cannot see. He is building a stronger faith inside you. He is shaping your character, and He is preparing blessings that will arrive at exactly the right time. And one day you will look back on this season and realize something powerful, and you will realize that even when God seemed silent, He was guiding every step. Part 3. And Biblical Wisdom about Faith. Story of David, Job, and waiting seasons. God often does his greatest work during the seasons when his people are waiting. And waiting is not wasted time in God's kingdom. Waiting is often where faith becomes stronger. Think about the life of David. Before David became king, and God had already chosen him, the prophet Samuel anointed David and declared that would be the future king of Israel. But after that moment, and David did not immediately sit on a throne. Instead, he entered one of the most difficult seasons of his life. King Saul became jealous of him. Saul saw David as a threat, and suddenly David's life became dangerous. The same man who had defeated a giant, the same man who had been chosen by God, was now running for his life, and David hid in caves. He wandered through deserts. He lived as a fugitive. Years passed in uncertainty. Imagine how confusing that must have been, and God had promised him a crown. But his reality looked like suffering. This is one of the hardest experiences for believers, when God gives a promise, but the present situation looks completely different. During those years in the wilderness, David could have become bitter. He could have stopped trusting God, and he could have decided to take control of the situation himself. But David chose a different path. David continued trusting God's timing, and even when he had an opportunity to harm Saul and take the throne early, he refused. Because David understood something important, and a blessing taken before God's time can become a burden instead of a blessing. So David waited, he trusted, he prayed, and finally, and when God's time arrived, David became king. The waiting season had prepared him. The caves had shaped his heart. The struggles had built his character. And without those years of silence, David would not have been the leader God intended him to be. Another powerful example is the story of Job, and Job was a man who loved God deeply. He lived with integrity. He honored God in every area of his life. But suddenly, tragedy entered his life. He lost his wealth, and he lost his health. He even lost his children. Pain surrounded him from every direction. And during that suffering, God seemed silent. Job asked questions, and he searched for answers. He cried out in his pain. But heaven did not immediately explain what was happening. This is something many believers struggle with. And why would a loving God allow suffering without explanation? But the story of Job reveals something powerful. Even when God is silent, he is still in control. And even when we do not understand, God still has a purpose. Job's faith was tested in ways most people cannot imagine. But Job continued to hold on to God. And eventually, God restored everything Job had lost. In fact, the Bible says that Job's life ended with greater blessings than he had before. But the blessing came after the testing, and the restoration came after the waiting. Faith is often strengthened in the moments when we feel weakest, because when we have no other answers, we learn to depend completely on God. And that kind of faith becomes unshakable. And there are many people today who believe faith means never feeling doubt. But the Bible shows something different. Faith is not the absence of questions, and faith is choosing to trust God even while questions exist. Faith says, God, I do not understand this moment, but I believe you are still guiding my life. God, and I cannot see the future, but I know you hold the future in your hands. And that kind of faith brings peace even in uncertain seasons. And sometimes God allows silence so that our relationship with Him can grow deeper. When life is easy, it is possible to forget how much we need God. But when we face challenges, we begin to seek Him more sincerely. We pray more deeply. We listen more carefully. We depend on Him more completely. And through that process, our faith becomes stronger. Our trust becomes deeper. Our relationship with God becomes more real. And the truth is that every believer will face silent seasons at some point. No one is exempt from waiting. No one is exempt from uncertainty. But those seasons do not have to destroy our faith. Instead, they can strengthen it. Because the silence of God often leads us to the presence of God. And in His presence, we discover something powerful.